Caldren Morrow thought he buried his son 10 years ago, until the day he saw Riven Morrow alive, smiling, and walking beside a family that wasn't his own. Riven Morrow was declared dead on a cruise ship, but a decade later, Caldren Morrow spotted him in a crowded market, older, changed, and hiding under a new identity. Caldren Morrow never believed the story behind his son's death. Then he saw Riven Morrow standing in front of him, alive and part of a life built on lies. Riven Morrow vanished on a luxury cruise, and Caldren Morrow mourned him for 10 years, until a single glance proved the dead do sometimes return. Caldren Morrow was handed his son's ashes, but 10 years later, he saw Riven Morrow holding a child that looked exactly like he did at that age. Caldren Morrow had spent most of his adult life working long hours, living quietly, and saving every spare dollar he earned. The trip he planned with his son, Riven Morrow, was something he had looked forward to for years. It was meant to be a celebration of Riven turning 21, a chance to step away from routines and responsibilities, and a rare moment for father and son to reconnect after drifting apart during Riven's teenage years. The cruise promised bright weather, open seas, and a week with nothing but time, something Caldren seldom allowed himself to enjoy. He believed this trip might become a memory they would both hold on to for years. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare he would never fully escape. The first days aboard the ship moved smoothly. Caldren watched Riven explore the decks with curiosity, studying the massive structure as though it were a floating city. Riven had always been observant, the type of person who noticed small details that others ignored. He wandered through the art displays, practiced his photography on the ship's upper decks, and stayed up late reading travel guides about the places they would visit. Caldren admired this about him, the sense of wonder he somehow never lost. Even so, something about Riven during the trip felt slightly distant. At times, he seemed distracted by his phone or lost in thought, staring out at the horizon for long periods as if waiting for something or someone. Caldren assumed it was just the excitement of independence or the stress of adulthood beginning to settle in. On the fourth night of the cruise, the ship hosted its biggest event, a themed celebration with music, elaborate decorations, and entertainment spread across several floors. People danced, drank freely, and moved from hall to hall in a whirlwind of flashing lights and noise. Caldren stayed only for a short time before excusing himself, feeling overwhelmed by the crowd. Riven stayed behind, saying he wanted to take some photos of the event and maybe explore the upper decks afterward. Caldren remembered the way he smiled, a genuine, bright expression that pushed away any doubts. That would be the last moment he saw his son alive. Sometime after midnight, Caldren was woken by urgent knocking on his cabin door. A crew member stood there, tense and shaken, informing him that Riven had been found near a restricted maintenance area of the ship. Caldren followed him through dim, narrow hallways, feeling his heartbeat hammering in his chest. When he reached the scene, several officers and medical staff were already gathered. Riven lay on the floor, still and pale, under harsh overhead lights that made the moment feel unreal. Caldren felt the world tilt around him. He waited for someone to offer an explanation, some reassurance that there had been a mistake, but no such comfort came. The staff told him the area where Riven was found was not open to passengers. There were no signs of injury beyond superficial scrapes, no indications of a struggle. They suggested he might have slipped or lost his way after drinking. Caldren knew this couldn't be true. Riven rarely drank, and even if he had, he would never have wandered into a restricted part of the ship on purpose. He demanded to see the security footage, desperate to understand how his son had ended up there. Officials informed him that the camera covering that corridor had malfunctioned earlier that evening. They assured him that it was an unfortunate coincidence and promised to conduct a full internal investigation. As Caldren stood there in shock, he noticed something else that felt wrong. Riven's belongings were incomplete.
His phone, always glued to his hand, was nowhere to be found. The camera he used constantly was missing as well. Even the simple wristband used for cabin access had disappeared. Someone brushed off his concerns by explaining that passengers often misplace items during crowded events. Caldren felt anger rising inside him, a burning certainty that this explanation was an insult to his intelligence. He knew his son. Riven was organized and protective of his possessions. Nothing about this situation made sense. The hours that followed became a blur of paperwork, hushed discussions between crew members, and uncomfortable pauses. Caldren watched officials exchange glances that suggested they knew more than they were willing to reveal. The ship's medical examiner later declared Riven's death accidental, citing possible disorientation or misadventure. Caldren felt the word strike him like blows. An accident, a vague, simple label for something that shattered his life. The remainder of the cruise passed in slow motion. While other passengers enjoyed the final days of their vacation, Caldren stayed in his cabin, replaying every memory of the trip and analyzing every strange moment he had noticed in Riven's behavior. He remembered the distracted expressions, the long absences, the mysterious emails Riven checked but never explained, and the unusual symbol he had seen drawn faintly on Riven's wrist 2 nights before. The one Riven quickly washed off when confronted. At the time, Caldren assumed it was random doodling or part of the crew's activities. Now he wondered if it had been something far more serious. When the ship finally docked, Caldren stepped onto the pier carrying a small sealed container holding his son's ashes. His legs felt weak beneath him. Reporters were waiting, already informed of a passenger's death. The cruise company representatives offered rehearsed condolences and a printed statement expressing sympathy without accepting any responsibility. Caldren tried asking questions, but each attempt was shut down or redirected. The ship continued preparing for its next departure as if nothing had happened. Back home, Caldren found himself sitting alone at his kitchen table, staring at the ashes of the person he loved most in the world. He replayed every detail from the trip until the memories blurred together. Something terrible had happened aboard that ship, something calculated, hidden behind excuses and missing evidence. He knew it deep in his bones, and although he couldn't explain it yet, he sensed that Riven's death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a truth he was not yet ready to confront, one that would haunt him for years and lead him to answers he never expected to find. Caldren Morrow returned home from the cruise with a quiet heaviness that refused to leave him. The world around him continued to move forward, but he remained stuck on the night his son's life ended without reason. Every corner of his house reminded him of Riven. The photographs on the walls, the unfinished projects scattered across the living room, the camera lenses Riven collected on a shelf. Each detail pressed into Caldren's heart like a weight he could never lift. Days blended into weeks as he tried to understand what had happened, but the truth remained buried under incomplete reports and unanswered questions. The official investigation closed quickly, far more quickly than Caldren believed was reasonable. Authorities in the port city sent him a summary that was disappointingly thin. According to the documents, Riven had been found in a restricted area due to accidental wandering, possibly caused by confusion or exhaustion. The report stated there was no evidence of foul play and no responsibility fell on the cruise line. Caldren read those pages over and over, searching for something he missed, but they offered nothing but vague generalities. It disturbed him how easily the case had been dismissed, as though his son's life could be summarized in 2 bland paragraphs. His attempts to retrieve digital information brought even more frustration. Riven's email account required passwords Caldren did not know, and the service provider refused access without legal clearance. The camera that Riven carried throughout the trip should have held hundreds of photos, yet it had never been recovered. Even the cruise line claimed no record of finding it among lost belongings. every missing piece felt intentional, as if fragments of Riven's final days were being quietly erased. The more Caldren questioned the inconsistencies, the more resistance he met. He sensed that people were not simply being unhelpful, they were avoiding something. Caldren tried reaching out to other passengers who had been on the ship. He posted inquiries online, hoping someone had seen Riven that night or noticed anything unusual around the restricted deck area. A few responded with sympathy, but none had useful information. Most people had been busy enjoying the event, unaware of anything beyond the flashing lights and loud music. One person mentioned that parts of the ship seemed strangely understaffed that evening. Another recalled hearing a loud alarm somewhere near the maintenance levels, but said crew members quickly brushed it off. The comments were too scattered to form a clear picture, but they strengthened Caldren's belief that something had gone terribly wrong. Months passed, and Caldren grew consumed by the small details that still didn't add up. The strange symbol he had once seen drawn on Riven's wrist became a recurring thought. It had been shaped like a twisted loop, a design he had never seen before. Why would Riven hide it so quickly? Why had it seemed so important to erase it? Caldren began searching for similar markings online, but found nothing. Late at night, he often sat at his desk surrounded by notes, printed emails, and fragments of conversations he had documented, hoping these pieces would eventually connect. But each attempt seemed to push him further into confusion. Some evenings, Caldren wondered if grief itself made him see patterns where none existed. He recognized that trauma could distort memory and heighten suspicion. Yet the emptiness surrounding Riven's death felt too deliberate, too carefully constructed to be a simple accident. Whenever Caldren attempted to ask for updates from the cruise line's security department, he received the same standardized responses. Each email thanked him for his patience while reminding him the investigation had concluded. The company refused to release raw footage from the ship's cameras, citing privacy laws and internal policies. Those missing recordings gnawed at him, creating a hollow space filled with imagined possibilities. People around Caldren eventually stopped asking how he was doing. At work, he found himself drifting through tasks without fully registering them. His colleagues offered condolences, but after several months, most assumed he was healing. He avoided explaining that he still woke every night to replay the moment he saw Riven still form on the ship's cold metal floor. He kept this pain hidden, not because he was strong, but because he no longer knew how to express it. He feared that speaking it out loud too often would only remind him how powerless he felt. A year after the incident, Caldren began boxing up Riven's belongings. It was not an act of letting go, but an effort to preserve what remained. Every object felt significant. He stored his son's favorite jacket, notebooks filled with half-written ideas, small souvenirs from childhood trips, and even receipts he found in drawers. He placed them carefully into storage containers labeled with dates only he would ever understand. Among the items was a sealed envelope addressed to someone named Karrow, a name Caldren had never heard before. The envelope was empty, and no clues inside explained who Karrow was. Still, the discovery unsettled him deeply. It was another fragment that lacked context, another piece of a puzzle he did not know how to complete. Over time, Caldren tried to reach a sense of acceptance, though acceptance was not the right word for what he felt. He simply learned to live with the silence. When a memory threatened to overwhelm him, he buried himself in work or took long walks through neighborhoods he had never visited before. He often found himself staring at families in parks or restaurants, imagining how different his life might have been if Riven had returned home from that cruise alive. Sometimes he wondered if Riven had been involved in something dangerous, something he had tried to hide. Other times, he convinced himself that every doubt he had was nothing more than a grieving father's fear. 10 years passed, and Caldren managed to build a life around the loss. But he never stopped searching quietly for answers. He occasionally typed Riven's name into search engines, hoping for some overlooked clue or unexpected update. But nothing new ever appeared. The world had moved on entirely. Only Caldren remained anchored to the past, unable to release a story that felt unfinished. He told himself that the truth, whatever it was, would never reveal itself. But that belief began to crumble the day he stepped into a crowded Florida market and saw a man who should have gone forever. The sight hit him like a shockwave. In that instant, the silence that had surrounded Riven's death for a decade cracked open, and Caldren sensed that everything he thought he had accepted was about to unravel.
Caldren Morrow had traveled to Florida for a routine business seminar, something he had done many times before. He expected nothing unusual from the trip, just long presentations, quiet dinners alone, and evenings spent in a modest hotel room. On the final day of his visit, with a few hours to spare before his flight, he decided to take a walk through a nearby coastal market. The market was popular with tourists and locals, filled with colorful booths, handcrafted goods, and the sense of grilled seafood drifting through the warm air. Caldren wandered without purpose, trying to distract himself from the lingering heaviness that always lived in the background of his thoughts. As he moved between stalls selling seashell jewelry and homemade candles, a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. A man stepped out from a booth on the opposite side of the walkway, holding the hand of a young woman and carrying a toddler balanced on his hip. It was a simple family scene, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone else, but it froze Caldren where he stood. The man turned slightly, giving Caldren a clear view of his profile. In that instant, the world around him seemed to blur, leaving only the figure in focus. The man shared the same jawline, the same birthmark near the ear, the same way of holding his shoulders. He looked older, his features more defined, but unmistakably familiar. Caldren's breath caught. The man looked exactly like Riven, 10 years older, alive, moving casually through the market as if his existence had never been questioned. For a moment, Caldren thought his mind was betraying him, twisting a stranger's face into the image of the son he had lost. But the more he looked, the more certainty replaced confusion. The resemblance was too precise to be chance. He felt an overwhelming rush of shock, disbelief, and something like hope, though it was heavily buried beneath fear. The man did not seem to recognize Caldren. He turned away quickly, pulling the woman and child toward a row of food trucks. At first, Caldren stood frozen, unsure if he should follow. Years of grief had taught him caution. He questioned his sanity, his memory, his ability to trust what he saw. But then, the man glanced back briefly, his eyes brushing across Caldren for barely a second. The expression on his face was not of confusion or polite acknowledgement. It was something sharper, an awareness, a flicker of tension as though he had seen a ghost. That small reaction was enough to propel Caldren forward. He followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. The couple moved through the market, stopping occasionally to look at a booth or adjust the child's sun hat. The woman appeared relaxed and unaware of anything unusual. The child babbled happily, pointing at colorful displays. Only the man, Riven, or someone impossibly identical, seemed alert, his movements slightly guarded. Caldren trailed them through several blocks as they left the market and entered a quiet residential area near the water. The man walked with purpose, not slowing until they approached a gated neighborhood with a high security fence. He took out a key card and tapped it against a small panel to allow the gate to open. As the family stepped through, the man looked back one last time. There was no hint of recognition in his expression now, only a cold, unreadable calm.
Then he disappeared behind the gate, leaving Caldren staring at the barrier between them. Unable to follow, Caldren stood on the sidewalk for a long time, trying to understand what he had witnessed. His thoughts moved in sharp, disjointed fragments. If the man truly was Riven, then everything about the cruise, the investigation, and the ashes he brought home was a lie. But if it wasn't Riven, if this was simply someone who resembled him, then why had the man reacted so strongly? The encounter stirred emotions Caldren had buried for years, reopening wounds he thought had scarred over. He returned to his hotel room unable to calm the storm inside him. He spent hours replaying the scene, analyzing every detail. He compared the man's features to old photographs on his phone. The shape of the chin, the slope of the nose, the faint line under one eye, each similarity felt undeniable. Yet, Caldren questioned himself repeatedly. Emotional memory could be deceptive, especially when tied to loss. Still, the certainty in his gut refused to quiet. The next morning, instead of heading to the airport, Caldren rented a car and drove back to the gated community. From a distance, he examined the entry area, memorizing the name posted near the front, Sea Wind Park Residences. He parked nearby and watched for several hours, hoping the family might reappear, but no one matching their description came through the gate. He considered approaching the security guard, asking about the residence, but realized it would raise suspicion. He needed more information, not impulsive actions. When he finally boarded his flight home, his mind remained consumed by the encounter. Everything he believed about Riven's death began to unravel. The missing belongings, the unavailable camera, the faulty security footage, the rushed investigation. All of it seemed different now, as if part of a carefully crafted illusion. He wondered whether Riven had disappeared intentionally or if someone had forced him into a new life. The possibilities were endless, each more unsettling than the last. Back home, Caldren tried searching for clues online. He entered the name of the gated community, looking for property records or resident details. Most information was restricted, but he found a few promotional photos of the neighborhood, which aligned with what he had seen. He scrolled through local social media pages, hoping someone might have posted pictures of events or gatherings held there. Hours passed, but nothing surfaced that confirmed the man's identity. Still, Caldren could not let go of the moment he locked eyes with the man at the market. That brief flash of recognition, however faint, convinced him he was not imagining things. Something was deeply wrong, and the truth was connected to the decade-old mystery that had haunted him. In the days that followed, Caldren contacted a private investigator, searching for someone skilled enough to uncover information he could not access. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but he also knew he could not go back to the silence he had lived in for 10 years. The man in the market had revived every unanswered question, every doubt, every unsettled instinct he had pushed away.
Caldren Morrow had traveled to Florida for a routine business seminar, something he had done many times before. He expected nothing unusual from the trip, just long presentations, quiet dinners alone, and evenings spent in a modest hotel room. On the final day of his visit, with a few hours to spare before his flight, he decided to take a walk through a nearby coastal market. The market was popular with tourists and locals, filled with colorful booths, handcrafted goods, and the sense of grilled seafood drifting through the warm air. Caldren wandered without purpose, trying to distract himself from the lingering heaviness that always lived in the background of his thoughts. As he moved between stalls selling seashell jewelry and homemade candles, a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. A man stepped out from a booth on the opposite side of the walkway, holding the hand of a young woman and carrying a toddler balanced on his hip. It was a simple family scene, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone else, but it froze Caldren where he stood. The man turned slightly, giving Caldren a clear view of his profile. In that instant, the world around him seemed to blur, leaving only the figure in focus. The man shared the same jawline,
the same birthmark near the ear, the same way of holding his shoulders. He looked older, his features more defined, but unmistakably familiar. Caldren's breath caught. The man looked exactly like Riven, 10 years older, alive, moving casually through the market as if his existence had never been questioned. For a moment, Caldren thought his mind was betraying him, twisting a stranger's face into the image of the son he had lost. But the more he looked, the more certainty replaced confusion. The resemblance was too precise to be chance. He felt an overwhelming rush of shock, disbelief, and something like hope, though it was heavily buried beneath fear. The man did not seem to recognize Caldren. He turned away quickly, pulling the woman and child toward a row of food trucks. At first, Caldren stood frozen, unsure if he should follow. Years of grief had taught him caution. He questioned his sanity, his memory, his ability to trust what he saw. But then the man glanced back briefly, his eyes brushing across Caldren for barely a second. The expression on his face was not of confusion or polite acknowledgement. It was something sharper, an awareness, a flicker of tension as though he had seen a ghost. That small reaction was enough to propel Caldren forward. He followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. The couple moved through the market, stopping occasionally to look at a booth or adjust the child's sun hat. The woman appeared relaxed and unaware of anything unusual. The child babbled happily, pointing at colorful displays. Only the man, Riven, or someone impossibly identical, seemed alert, his movements slightly guarded. Caldren trailed them through several blocks as they left the market and entered a quiet residential area near the water. The man walked with purpose, not slowing until they approached the gated neighborhood with a high security fence. He took out a key card and tapped it against the small panel to allow the gate to open. As the family stepped through, the man looked back one last time. There was no hint of recognition in his expression now, only a cold, unreadable calm. Then he disappeared behind the gate, leaving Caldren staring at the barrier between them. Unable to follow, Caldren stood on the sidewalk for a long time, trying to understand what he had witnessed. His thoughts moved in sharp, disjointed fragments. If the man truly was Riven, then everything about the cruise, the investigation, and the ashes he brought home was a lie. But if it wasn't Riven, if this was simply someone who resembled him, then why had the man reacted so strongly? The encounter stirred emotions Caldren had buried for years, reopening wounds he thought had scarred over. He returned to his hotel room unable to calm the storm inside him. He spent hours replaying the scene, analyzing every detail. He compared the man's features to old photographs on his phone. The shape of the chin, the slope of the nose, the faint line under one eye, each similarity felt undeniable. Yet, Caldren questioned himself repeatedly. Emotional memory could be deceptive, especially when tied to loss. Still, the certainty in his gut refused to quiet. The next morning, instead of heading to the airport, Caldren rented a car and drove back to the gated community. From a distance, he examined the entry area, memorizing the name posted near the front, Sea Wind Park Residences. He parked nearby and watched for several hours, hoping the family might reappear, but no one matching their description came through the gate. He considered approaching the security guard, asking about the residence, but realized it would raise suspicion. He needed more information, not impulsive actions. When he finally boarded his flight home, his mind remained consumed by the encounter. Everything he believed about Riven's death began to unravel. The missing belongings, the unavailable camera, the faulty security footage, the rushed investigation. All of it seemed different now, as if part of a carefully crafted illusion. He wondered whether Riven had disappeared intentionally or if someone had forced him into a new life. The possibilities were endless, each more unsettling than the last. Back home, Caldren tried searching for clues online. He entered the name of the gated community, looking for property records or resident details. Most information was restricted, but he found a few promotional photos of the neighborhood, which aligned with what he had seen. He scrolled through local social media pages, hoping someone might have posted pictures of events or gatherings held there. Hours passed, but nothing surfaced that confirmed the man's identity. Still, Caldren could not let go of the moment he locked eyes with the man at the market. That brief flash of recognition, however faint, convinced him he was not imagining things. Something was deeply wrong, and the truth was connected to the decade-old mystery that had haunted him. In the days that followed, Caldren contacted a private investigator, searching for someone skilled enough to uncover information he could not access. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but he also knew he could not go back to the silence he had lived in for 10 years. The man in the market had revived every unanswered question, every doubt, every unsettled instinct he had pushed away.
Caldren Morrow chose the private investigator with more caution than he had used in any decision in years. He didn't want someone who would treat the case like a novelty or assume he was an unstable father chasing ghosts. He needed someone who understood hidden identities, missing persons, and the darker corners of human behavior. That was how he found Sorrel Vaughn, a former fraud analyst who specialized in uncovering digital deception. She listened carefully as he described the encounter at the Florida market, taking detailed notes without judgment. Her calm, precise manner gave Caldren a rare sense of stability, something he had not felt since the day he lost Riven. Sorrel began her investigation by collecting every piece of background information she could find about the gated community. She used legal records, real estate documents, and obscure online directories to narrow down potential matches for the man Caldren had seen. After 2 weeks, she found something unusual. A resident named Darren Holt with no public records before the last decade. No school history, no medical files, no employment details prior to a single employer in Florida. It was as if Darren Holt had simply appeared out of thin air. The discovery immediately raised questions, and Caldren felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. People didn't erase their pasts without reason. Sorrel deepened her search, tracing Darren Holt's financial activities. She uncovered patterns that seemed both ordinary and suspicious. Darren received a steady paycheck from a local design firm and made regular payments on his home. But buried within these predictable transactions were several international money transfers from accounts linked to dating websites known for romance scams. The amounts were small enough to avoid red flags, yet consistent enough to suggest long-term involvement. Caldren stared at the printed statements in disbelief. None of this resembled the life he imagined for Riven, yet the pieces continued aligning with the reality he had seen at the market. When Sorrel asked for access to any personal items belonging to Riven, Caldren retrieved the storage boxes he had packed years earlier. Together, they sorted through notebooks, letters, photographs, and random objects collected over time. In one of the notebooks, hidden among sketches and unfinished writings, they discovered a list of usernames linked to online profiles. Sorrel cross-referenced them and found that several had once been associated with fraudulent dating accounts created more than a decade ago. The dates matched the period before Riven's death. The realization struck Caldren with the force of a truth he never wanted to understand. His son had been involved in something dangerous long before stepping onto the cruise ship. Sorrel followed the digital trail further and eventually found a name tied repeatedly to the suspicious accounts: Karrow Fen.
The name appeared in hidden messaging boards and scam network discussions, often connected to more sophisticated operations. Based on the information she uncovered, Karrow Fen was a manipulator who recruited young adults into romance investment rings. These rings promised easy income in exchange for helping to lure wealthy individuals into emotional and financial traps. It was a shadowy world built on lies, crafted identities, and untraceable transactions. According to scattered rumors, Karrow had orchestrated staged disappearances in the past to free members from their original lives and debts. The cruise accident, as Caldren had been forced to accept for so many years, suddenly took on an entirely different shape. Sorrell explained that staged deaths were a known tactic used by certain criminal networks to give members a clean slate. Once a death was believed and documented, the individual could be relocated, given new credentials, and integrated into a different environment under a new identity. The lack of security footage, the missing belongings, the rushed investigation, all of it aligned with the pattern Sorrell had uncovered about previous cases linked to Karrow Fen. Caldren felt the room tilt as the truth settled in his chest. The symbol he once saw drawn on Riven's wrist, the mysterious name on the envelope he found, the odd behavior during the cruise, it all connected in ways he had never imagined. Riven hadn't been a random victim. He had been involved in a network operating beyond Caldren's awareness, and someone had orchestrated his disappearance under the guise of death. The ashes Caldren carried home from the cruise were suddenly called into question. He had never been allowed to identify the remains. The sealed container had been presented to him as a completed process requiring nothing from him but acceptance. He now realized how easily he had been manipulated during his grief. Sorrell didn't stop there. She studied old photos from the Florida market that Caldren had attempted to discreetly capture. Using facial comparison tools, she confirmed that the likelihood of Darren Holt and Riven Morrow being the same person was extremely high. The shape of the ears, small facial asymmetries, and the faint birthmark near the left ear all matched. It was as close to confirmation as they could obtain without direct confrontation. Caldren spent nights lying awake, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Anger at the people who had taken his son, anger at Riven for hiding such a dangerous life, relief that he was alive, grief for the decade lost, fear of what confronting him might cause. For years, Caldren had learned to live with tragedy. Now he had to learn to live with something far more complicated. The truth that his son had chosen a path he never understood and had allowed Caldren to believe his death as part of that choice. As Sorrell continued gathering information, she found that Karrow Fen had vanished years earlier. Authorities believed he had either assumed a new identity or fled overseas. Many of his former recruits had been left to rebuild their lives in silence. The network had weakened and dispersed, leaving behind people who were essentially ghosts in official records. Darren Holt appeared to be one of them, someone given a second life with a new family, far from everything he once knew. Caldren realized that confronting Riven would not simply reopen old wounds. It might endanger his son's new life, expose his family to secrets they were likely unaware of, and potentially draw the attention of individuals who still operated in the shadows. He grappled with the truth that had taken a decade to uncover, unsure whether knowing it brought him relief or devastation. The weight of this discovery changed everything. Riven had not died. He had transformed. And whether through fear, pressure, or intention, he had allowed his father to believe a lie that shaped the next 10 years of his life. Now Caldren faced a decision no parent could prepare for: whether to pull his son out of the life he had built, or to walk away knowing he was alive but unreachable, living behind a name that was never truly his.
Caldren Morrow woke each morning, feeling the weight of a truth he never asked for, but could no longer ignore. His son, dead in official documents, mourned for a decade, buried in memory, was alive, living quietly under a new name with a family who believed in the identity he had been given. The discovery stripped away the certainty that had shaped Caldren's life for 10 years and replaced it with a storm of questions he could not silence. Every morning he told himself he would decide what to do, and every night he found himself trapped in the same inner conflict, unable to move forward. The truth had changed nothing and everything at the same time. Karrow Fen continued to send him updates, though none contained answers that eased his turmoil. She had uncovered nearly everything possible about Darren Holt: employment history, financial records, distant online activity, traces of his relocation path, but none of it revealed why Riven had agreed to let his former life end. The more Caldren learned, the clearer it became that Riven had entered the criminal network willingly, perhaps out of desperation, manipulation, or search for purpose. The romance investment ring was designed to lure young people with promises of opportunity and autonomy. Many fell into it gradually, unaware of the danger until they were entangled too deeply to escape. Riven, Karrow said gently, might have believed disappearing was the only way to survive. Caldren struggled with this possibility. He wanted to believe he had known his son well enough to sense when something was wrong, yet the evidence pointed in a different direction. Riven had been hiding something long before their cruise together. Caldren remembered the distracted expressions, the unexplained withdrawals from his bank account, the strange mark drawn on his wrist, and the nights he spent glued to his phone. These moments, dismissed as youthful secrecy, took on new meaning. Riven had been slipping away from his old life even before stepping onto the ship. In the second month after the Florida encounter, Caldren made a quiet decision to observe from a distance. He returned to the gated community under the guise of a weekend trip and parked far enough away to remain unseen. He did not know what he expected to find. Perhaps he hoped the man he believed was Riven would make some gesture or show some recognition. But the scene that unfolded was painfully ordinary. The man walked with a toddler on his shoulders. He laughed at something the woman said. He carried groceries, talked with neighbors, and lived a simple life unmarked by the chaos of his past. Caldren walked from behind tinted windows, his hands trembling as he tried to reconcile the image before him with the boy he lost a decade ago. There was no sign of distress, no indication that the man lived in fear or operated under coercion. Instead, he appeared settled, almost peaceful. Caldren realized this was a life Riven had built carefully over the years, a life without the weight of his mistakes and without the father who had spent 10 years grieving him. The thought was painful, but it carried a strange sense of relief. Riven had survived the darkness that once surrounded him and created a world where he could exist without deception or danger. That, at least, brought Caldren some comfort. Back home, Caldren placed Karrow's final report into a drawer he rarely opened.
The document contained everything: the timeline of the staged death, the connection to Karrow Fen, the process that transformed Riven into Darren Holt, and the confirmation that the man he had seen was almost certainly his son. It was a complete narrative, with no remaining gaps large enough to hide behind. Yet the report was not an ending. It was a crossroads, one that Caldren faced alone. Each scenario he imagined carried consequences he feared. If he approached Riven, he risked bringing his son's criminal past into the open, potentially destroying his family's stability. He imagined the look of confusion or horror the woman might have if she learned her partner had once lived under another identity. He imagined the fear in the child's eyes if strangers arrived to question their father. On the other hand, if Riven had chosen this path willingly and knowingly allowed his father to believe he was dead, then confronting him might reopen wounds neither of them were ready to face. Caldren's heart ached at the idea that Riven might reject him outright. He pictured reaching out, only to find his son turning away, unwilling to acknowledge the life he once lived. The fear of that possibility tightened around him like a vice. Losing Riven once had nearly destroyed him. Losing him again, this time by choice, would be unbearable. In the third month, Caldren returned one last time to the coastal town. He didn't go near the gated community, but instead visited a public park nearby. From a bench shaded by tall trees, he watched families move about their day, children learning to ride bicycles, parents chatting under umbrellas, dogs tugging at their leashes. After some time, he noticed a familiar figure in the distance, walking with slow, relaxed steps. The man who looked like Riven pushed a stroller while holding the hand of a young child who giggled at passing birds. He looked content, absorbed in the small joys of everyday life. Caldren remained still, watching the quiet scene unfold. He didn't approach, he didn't call out, he didn't try to capture the moment with his phone. Instead, he let his eyes memorize the rhythm of Riven's steps, the slope of his shoulders, the way he knelt to adjust the child's shoe. These small actions were enough to tell Caldren what he needed to know. His son was alive, safe, and far removed from the dangerous world he had once entered. When the family eventually left the park, Caldren stayed seated, allowing the peace of the moment to settle inside him. He had come searching for answers, and though the truth was painful, he had found it. Riven had chosen a life without him, but he had also chosen survival, growth, and a chance at happiness. Caldren understood then that the most difficult choice he could make was also the most loving one. That evening, he returned home and locked the final report into the drawer. He sat quietly in his living room, feeling a sense of closure he had never expected. The grief was still there, but it had softened, reshaped by the truth. His son had not been stolen by fate or violence. He had escaped into a different life. And though Caldren would never be part of that world, knowing Riven lived on was enough. He would carry the secret alone, protecting the fragile life his son had built. And in the silence of his small home, Caldren finally allowed himself to breathe in the truth he had spent 10 years chasing, accepting that love sometimes meant holding on and sometimes meant walking away. Caldren returned home carrying the heavy truth like a second shadow. The discovery of his son's hidden life had changed something deep inside him, but the world around him remained the same. His small house looked untouched by time, the same mailbox with peeling paint, the same creaking porch steps, the same framed photographs that seemed to watch him as he walked through the door. Riven's graduation portrait still sat on the corner table, a reminder of a life that once felt straightforward. Now it felt like a relic from a reality that never truly existed. For weeks after the trip to Florida, Caldren lived in a strange rhythm. His workdays passed mechanically and his nights stretched long and sleepless. He tried to find peace in ordinary habits, like organizing the kitchen drawers or tending the neglected garden, yet everything reminded him of the unanswered questions he carried. He thought he had reached the end of the story when he chose not to confront Riven, but life rarely allowed endings to stay settled. One afternoon, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single note written in careful handwriting he didn't recognize. It contained only a date and a location, a remote park near the state line, the same place Caldren had taken Riven camping when he was young. There was no explanation, no instructions, just the information, as if someone assumed he already understood. He felt unease rise in his chest, but also a strange sense of purpose. The handwriting was not Riven's, yet something about it felt connected, as though it belonged to someone circling the edges of the story he thought he had already unraveled. After days of hesitation, he decided to go, not because he expected closure, but because ignoring the message felt like turning away from a truth that refused to remain hidden. On the chosen day, the park was nearly empty. Fallen leaves scattered across the paths, and a cold wind moved through the trees. Caldren followed the directions on the note until he reached an old wooden bridge, weathered by years of storms. He waited, unsure whether he expected someone to appear. Minutes passed, then footsteps sounded behind him, slow and deliberate. A woman approached him, her face partially covered by a hood. He recognized her only when she stepped closer. Karrow Fen, the private investigator who had helped him trace Riven's new identity. Her expression held a seriousness that made Caldren's stomach tighten. She handed him a sealed envelope without speaking. Her presence felt rushed, as if every second mattered. Before he could ask anything, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the trail. Caldren opened the envelope. Inside was a file containing details about a network connected to Karrow Fen, information far more extensive than what she had given him before. At the bottom was a note that simply read, "He was not the only one who vanished." The implication struck him with sudden clarity. Riven had not been the final recruit. Karrow's network had continued long after the staged cruise incident. The new documents listed unfamiliar names, dates, and places, people who disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to Riven's supposed death. Some identities had been replaced with new ones, others were marked as unknown. Among them, one name caught Caldren's attention: LaRon Quill. It was marked as a recent disappearance connected to a region not far from where Caldren lived. The pattern suggested the organization was still active, even if Karrow Fen himself had vanished. Caldren realized Sorrel had brought this information to him for a reason. She must have uncovered something dangerous, something she couldn't handle alone. Caldren spent the next days studying the documents. Each page revealed layers of manipulation, digital fraud, and false identities. The group appeared to recruit individuals in debt, loneliness, or desperation, offering them new lives in exchange for their loyalty. Once inside, recruits were isolated, transformed, and sometimes made to vanish. Riven had been one of the earliest cases, but clearly the system had evolved. The more Caldren read, the more he felt a creeping sense of dread. He had accepted his son's new life as a bittersweet ending, but now he feared the whole structure around that life was far from resolved. He felt torn between his desire to protect Riven and the moral weight of the truth he now held in his hands. If others were still being pulled into the same web, staying silent felt like an act of betrayal. Caldren began quietly investigating LaRon Quill's disappearance on his own. He visited addresses, observed patterns, and pieced together fragments. The trail led to an abandoned storage facility that stood at the edge of a rural town. Inside, he found discarded documents, burner phones, and a small symbol etched into the wall, the same symbol he had once noticed on Riven's wrist before the crew's tragedy. The realization shook him. This place had been part of the network's operations, and someone had left in a hurry. Among the scattered items, he discovered a piece of paper with a hastily written message. He is still looking. He didn't know whether it referred to Karrow Fen or someone else within the organization, but whoever it was, they hadn't vanished entirely. Something within the network was still alive, still searching, still moving. And now Caldren's presence here meant that he was no longer a distant observer. He had stepped into the story again, whether he intended to or not. Leaving the facility, Caldren felt a weight settle on him heavier than before. He had thought his journey ended the moment he let Riven go, but the truth had drawn him back. This time, the mystery was wider than his son. The network reached further than he ever imagined, threading through lives and identities like a hidden current beneath ordinary life. As he drove home, he realized he had a new purpose, one he never asked for but could not ignore. He understood now that the story was still unfolding, and he was standing at the edge of a deeper truth. And somewhere within that truth, the past he believed was buried had begun to rise again.
Caldren woke the next morning with the heavy awareness that his life had crossed a boundary he could no longer pretend wasn't there. The documents he had found in the abandoned storage facility still lay spread across his dining table, each page a reminder that the organization he believed dissolved was very much alive. He hadn't slept much, replaying every detail in his mind. The symbol etched on the wall, the scattered phones, the hurried exit, none of it felt random. Someone had been there recently, someone connected to the same group that had taken Riven and reshaped his life. Now Caldren feared that his renewed involvement placed him directly in their path. He spent hours sorting through the documents again, trying to identify patterns he had missed the night before. Each name carried its own tragedy. People who vanished quietly, people who left behind no evidence, people who reappeared under identities that never matched the lives they abandoned. The files showed a consistency that made Caldren uneasy. There was always a moment before disappearance, a financial hardship, a broken relationship, a feeling of failure. It seemed the organization preyed on vulnerability, offering escape to those who felt trapped. Riven's case now felt less like an isolated mistake and more like an early blueprint. Caldren tried to focus on LaRon Quill, the most recent victim mentioned in Sorrell's documents. The man had been a talented graphic designer, living alone, burdened with debt. He had disappeared 6 months earlier, leaving behind a nearly empty apartment and a computer wiped clean. Caldren could not shake the feeling that LaRon's case was somehow linked to the abandoned storage facility. He searched online forums, local papers, and public records. Every clue pointed to a coordinated effort, one that erased the digital footprint of its victims before rebuilding them as someone new. As he continued the search, Caldren noticed a black sedan parked across the street from his house. It was a vehicle he didn't recognize, and its presence lingered longer than a passing car should. He watched it from behind the curtain, expecting movement, but the windows were dark and the car remained still. After half an hour, it drove away slowly, as if waiting for the right moment to leave. The sight sent a chill up Caldren's spine. He wondered whether he had already drawn attention to himself. Over the next few days, the sedan appeared again, sometimes across the street,
sometimes farther down the block. It never stayed long, but it returned often enough to confirm Caldren's suspicion. Someone was watching him. Whether it was the group or a separate threat, he couldn't tell. The uncertainty began to eat at him, making him cautious about each step he took. He stopped leaving lights on at night, avoided predictable routines, and started locking every door twice. Still, he felt exposed. Whatever he had stumbled into was bigger than one missing man or one transformed identity. One evening, Caldren received a message slipped under his front door. His heart pounded as he opened it. The note contained only 2 words: "Stop looking." There was no signature, no explanation, just a warning. The simplicity of the message made it more unsettling than anything else he had encountered. It confirmed that someone knew exactly what he was doing and intended to control his next steps. It reminded him of the same silence and pressure he felt after Riven's supposed death, an invisible force pushing him away from the truth. Despite the warning, Caldren couldn't bring himself to stop. He felt responsible for the other victims. He knew what it meant to lose someone without answers, to be left with confusion and grief. The thought of others experiencing the same torment fueled his determination. Yet he also realized he lacked Sorrel's resources and experience. He needed her help, but she had vanished after delivering the file. He tried calling her number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried messaging her, but nothing delivered. It was as if she had disappeared in the same way the organization's victims had. He traveled to her office, only to find it empty. The furniture was gone, the windows bare, and the walls marked with faint outlines where pictures had once hung. The mailbox was stuffed with uncollected envelopes, and dust had begun to gather on the doorstep. It looked as though she had left in a hurry, just like the abandoned storage facility. He couldn't decide whether she had fled for her safety or been taken by those she was investigating. The thought of the latter filled him with dread. Sorrel knew the risks, yet she continued her work. Her disappearance felt like the latest piece of a puzzle that was becoming harder to ignore. Leaving the building, Caldren noticed the black sedan parked at the end of the street. This time, it didn't move when he stepped outside. He felt a surge of adrenaline and forced himself to walk calmly to his car. Once inside, he locked the doors and drove away, watching the sedan follow him for several blocks before turning down a different street. The message was clear. He was being monitored, and whoever was behind it was skilled at maintaining pressure without revealing themselves. Back at home, Caldren took a long breath and realized he had reached a point of no return. The organization was no longer a distant concept tied to his son's past. It was a living structure with eyes everywhere, capable of reaching into his life at will. He understood now that they thrived in the shadows, manipulating identities, controlling narratives, and silencing anyone who stepped too close to their operations. Sorrel had tried to expose them, and now she was gone. Caldren feared that he might be next. Still, something inside him refused to let fear dictate his choices. The truth had already changed him, reshaped his understanding of what had happened a decade earlier. He couldn't undo what he knew, and he couldn't ignore the clues that continued to surface. As he studied the documents one more time, he noticed a small detail he had overlooked, an address scribbled faintly in the corner of one page. It didn't match any of the others. It wasn't part of a case file. It felt like a personal note, something added after the document had been printed. He didn't know who had written it or why, but the discovery sparked a new wave of determination. The address was only a few towns away. It could be a trap, a clue, or nothing at all. But it was the only lead he had left. As he prepared to leave the house again, Caldren felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him. Yet beneath it, a quiet resolve grew stronger. The truth had already changed him, reshaped his understanding of what had happened a decade earlier. He couldn't undo what he knew, and he couldn't ignore the clues that continued to surface. As he studied the documents one more time, he noticed the small detail he had overlooked, an address scribbled faintly in the corner of one page. It didn't match any of the others. It wasn't part of a case file. It felt like a personal note, something added after the document had been printed. He didn't know who had written it or why, but the discovery sparked a new wave of determination. The address was only a few towns away. It could be a trap, a clue, or nothing at all. But it was the only lead he had left. As he prepared to leave the house again, Caldren felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him. Yet beneath it, a quiet resolve grew stronger. The truth had already changed him, reshaped his understanding of what had happened the decade earlier. He couldn't undo what he knew, and he couldn't ignore the clues that continued to surface. As he prepared to leave the house again, Caldren felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him. Yet beneath it, a quiet resolve grew stronger. The story had not ended with Riven's new identity or Sorrel's disappearance. The truth was still unfolding, and Caldren knew that he was stepping into a deeper layer of a world built on secrecy and reinvention. He locked the door behind him and drove toward the unknown, aware that whatever waited for him next would either reveal everything or consume him entirely.
Caldren drove toward the unfamiliar town with a mixture of fear and determination, gripping the wheel tightly as the empty highway stretched ahead. The address he had found in the corner of the document felt like both a lifeline and a threat. He repeated it silently, committing it to memory in case something happened. The landscape grew sparser as he approached the location, shifting from suburban comfort to long stretches of open land, scattered trees, and small clusters of houses that seemed forgotten by time. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that made everything feel slightly distorted, as if the world itself was warning him to turn back. He entered the town shortly after dusk. It was a quiet place, with a single traffic light and a handful of stores, most of them closed for the evening. The address he led him to an industrial area on the outskirts. Rows of warehouses lined up in grim silence. The building he was looking for appeared older than the rest, with faded paint and broken windows covered by sheets of plywood. There were no signs of activity, no vehicles nearby, and no lights visible through the cracks. It looked abandoned, yet something about it felt watched. Caldren parked several feet away and approached on foot, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. His heartbeat quickened as he stepped closer. Though the structure seemed empty, the air carried a faint sound, as if someone was moving inside. He paused, listening. The noise vanished, replaced by the hum of distant traffic. He waited several seconds before continuing. The entrance was locked, but the side door hung loosely on its hinges. When he pushed it open, it groaned loudly, alerting anyone inside to his presence. The interior was cold and dark, illuminated only by thin streaks of moonlight that passed through cracks in the walls. Dust covered the floor in undisturbed layers, except for a narrow trail of footprints leading toward the back of the building. Caldren followed them, every step heavy with uncertainty. At the far end of the warehouse, he found a small office room. The door was slightly ajar, and dim light flickered from within, the kind produced by a dying battery or an unstable bulb. He stepped inside and froze. The room contained a single desk with a portable light shining onto a scattered pile of documents. They were arranged in neat stacks, each labeled with code numbers and brief descriptions. Caldren recognized some of the names, people from Sorrel's file, individuals who had vanished and never resurfaced. The documents appeared more detailed than anything he had seen before, containing background histories, financial records, and psychological assessments. This wasn't merely an archive, it was a recruitment catalog. Next to the documents lay a thin folder with a handwritten label that made Caldren's stomach drop. Morrow, Stage 1. He reached for it with trembling hands. Inside was information about Riven he had never seen. Early financial stress, social media activity patterns, targeted contact attempts from unknown accounts, and detailed notes outlining his vulnerabilities. Each page recording how the organization had monitored him before making their first approach. Caldren felt a wave of nausea crash over him as he read how his son had been studied, profiled, and
gently maneuvered toward the path that eventually consumed him. As he turned the last page, he noticed a second folder beneath it, Morrow Stage 2. It was thinner, containing only a few pages. They detailed the cruise, the staged death, and the construction of Riven's new identity. The file ended abruptly, with no mention of Stage 3 or any follow-up on Riven's life as Darren Holt. It felt incomplete, as though the rest had been intentionally removed. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Caldren snapped to attention. He turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. His pulse hammered in his ears as he listened closely. Another sound followed, a slow, deliberate footstep. Someone else was inside. He moved away from the desk, placing himself against the wall and holding his breath. A faint silhouette passed by the open doorway, pausing as if sensing his presence. Caldren remained motionless, fighting the urge to run. After a tense moment, the figure continued down the hallway. He waited several more seconds before slipping out of the room and retreating through the path he had entered. His footsteps were silent, but his heartbeat felt loud enough to give him away. The moment he reached the outside air, he hurried toward his car, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. The warehouse stayed dark, but he felt the figure's presence lingering in the shadows. He drove away without turning on his headlights, only illuminating the road once he had put several blocks between himself and the building. His mind raced as he replayed the details of the documents he had found. The organization had been operating for years, building a network of people with new identities, each crafted with precision. Riven had been one of many. The implications widened the scope of the mystery far beyond what Caldren had imagined. Back home, he locked every window and door, pacing the living room as he tried to make sense of everything. He wondered how deeply the organization had infiltrated everyday systems, how many more people were involved, and whether whoever followed him in the warehouse now knew who he was. He also couldn't shake the thought that someone had intentionally left the folder for him to find. His son's name being front and center felt too purposeful. As he sat in the quiet house, he noticed something strange on his dining table. A single sheet of paper rested atop the pile of documents he had left there earlier. He hadn't placed it there. The message on it chilled him. "You are closer than you think." Caldren felt the room close in around him. The warning under his door, the figure in the warehouse, the car watching his home, these were not coincidences. The organization was aware of every step he took, and now they were letting him know he had crossed into territory they did not intend for him to reach. Yet beneath the fear, a new understanding settled into place. He had uncovered enough to know that the truth was within reach. Whatever the organization was planning, whatever they were protecting, he was moving toward the center of it all. The next move he made could expose everything or cost him everything. Still, he couldn't stop. Not after all he had learned. Not after realizing that Sorrel, Riven, and countless others were part of a story much larger than he ever imagined. For the first time, Caldren understood he was no longer searching for answers. He was part of the conflict itself, and the organization had finally noticed him.